Sandra Dee stepped onto the screen far too early, a child with a flawless face, wide innocent eyes, and a smile that made the entire nation believe she was the perfect picture of purity. Within just a few years, she had become Hollywood's premier teenage star of the late 1950s. Her image graced movie posters, magazine covers, and the daydreams of audiences who wanted to believe in a world where innocence was untouchable. But beneath that flawless exterior was a girl whose life had been tightly controlled, molded into a perfection so rigid it nearly crushed her spirit. Hollywood didn't just discover Sandra Dee's talent, it shaped her, manipulated her, and chipped away at the very sense of who she was. Though moviegoers adored the sweetness she radiated on screen, in private, Sandra struggled with fear, eating disorders, depression, and questions of identity. She possessed a natural ease in acting, a rare ability to show vulnerability with authenticity, but that very sensitivity became a vulnerability in an industry that never knew when to stop. Fame arrived too early, and the tools to protect herself never had a chance to form. Behind the curtain, what remained after the applause was not satisfaction but an emptiness that could not be filled. Sandra Dee's life was not just a story of early fame and burnout, it was the cost of perfection, and the story of a girl who lost herself the moment the world began to love her. Sandra's early life set the stage for everything that followed. Born Alexandra Zuck in 1942 in Beyond, New Jersey, she grew up in a fractured household. Her parents divorced when she was very young, and her world contracted around her mother, Mary Zuck. Decisions, big and small, were never shared, they were issued, and Sandra obeyed without question. Obedience became second nature, a habit ingrained before she could even recognize the possibility of choice. Money, too, was controlled entirely by her mother. Modeling fees, advertising contracts, and other earnings passed through Mary Zuck's hands. Sandra learned early that her value was defined by the numbers in a contract, but the power to spend, save, or manage that money was entirely someone else's. Work replaced childhood. By age 4 or 5, Sandra was on set, holding a smile until it was deemed right, moving from one photo shoot to the next, enduring long days under bright lights, hotel rooms for tutoring, and schedules that left no time for play. Praise came only for compliance, never for expression or creativity. The abuse she suffered at the hands of her stepfather was quiet, almost invisible, existing alongside the constant demands of work. Sandra learned early to compartmentalize, to separate pain at night from the performance expected during the day. Even her body became a tool in the production. Camera angles, lighting, and costume adjustments all dictated how she appeared. Her physical presence was measured and shaped, her face carefully lit to convey fragility. Long before she could form an independent identity, Sandra's body was part of an image, something to be polished and preserved for public consumption. By the early 1950s, Sandra Dee was a familiar face in New York advertising, moving seamlessly from modeling into regular photo spreads. By 1956, her income had reached approximately $75,000, a staggering sum for a child, and one that left her no opportunity to slow down. School, when it existed, revolved around work schedules, and friendships were fleeting, based on the temporary bonds formed on set rather than the neighborhoods or playgrounds of ordinary children. Childhood was never abruptly taken, it was carefully thinned, layer by layer, until only performance remained. Meals, weight, and appearance became another arena of control. Skipping food or restricting intake became a survival tactic, a way for Sandra to reclaim control over something that felt hers. Discipline blurred into self-punishment. Obedience was rewarded, and hunger became a mark of success. The body learned to shrink on its own, quietly and relentlessly, to meet expectations that were never fully spoken aloud. In 1957, Hollywood noticed. Until They Sail brought Sandra from modeling to the silver screen. Her performance didn't spark an immediate sensation, but it proved she could be relied on, adaptable, innocent, and young enough to promise years of profit. That same year, she won the Golden Globe for New Star of the Year, and press narratives quickly cast her as a grown-up Shirley Temple. Universal signed her not merely to act, but to maintain an entire public persona. Every hairstyle, outfit, and public appearance was controlled, carefully calibrated to preserve the image. Growing up was no longer natural, it had become something to be managed. By 1959, with Imitation of Life, Sandra Dee reached the height of recognition. The film grossed over $50 million, and her face became inseparable from the innocence audiences had learned to expect. Gig, another hit, reinforced the template, energetic, sweet, non-threatening. Sandra Dee was no longer just an actress, she had become a cultural anchor, a symbol of a specific kind of American youth. Audiences sought reassurance, not transformation. Any deviation from that image risked destabilizing a career built on certainty. But the very system that had protected her also constrained her. Roles demanded the same sweetness, youthfulness became mandatory, and her body had to remain frozen in time. Her marriage to Bobby Darin layered her already dense schedule with additional pressure. Pregnancy, childbirth, and subsequent miscarriages occurred under the relentless scrutiny of work and public expectation. Medication, initially a tool for energy and endurance, gradually became a coping mechanism for grief and exhaustion. Alcohol followed, blurring the line between survival and dependency. The trauma of her childhood persisted, quietly shaping intimacy, self-image, and relationships. Silence, endurance, and self-sacrifice, learned to survive, became the habits that dictated her adult life. Marital conflicts reflected intersecting wounds. Bobby, despite love and care, could not understand the depth of Sandra's history. Divorce, when it occurred, was not a failure of love, it was recognition that she could no longer carry the weight of her past alongside the public image she had always maintained. After Bobby's death at 37, Sandra's isolation intensified. Alcoholism deepened, eating disorders worsened, and her life, once kept in motion by schedules and work, became slower, heavier, and quieter. The world that had once frozen her image in time had moved on, leaving her alone with memories and wounds that had never been fully processed. In 1994, Sandra published Dream Lovers, a memoir not meant to revive her career, but to reclaim her story. She spoke openly about abuse, eating disorders, alcoholism, and grief, the parts of life that had never been publicly acknowledged. The book did not erase her past, but it gave her control over its telling, changing it from an invisible force into something confronted, even if not fully healed. Sandra Dee's final years were marked by illness, frailty, and the physical consequences of decades of control and survival. She died in 2005 quietly, without ceremonies, tributes, or public recognition. The world remembered the innocent girl, the idealized teenager, but the real Sandra, the woman who had endured, survived, and quietly fought to reclaim herself, remained largely unseen. Her legacy is complex. Sandra Dee exists in memory as a symbol of perfection, innocence, and reassurance. Yet the woman behind the icon endured a life shaped by control, silence, and sacrifice. She did not collapse suddenly. She wore down slowly, layer by layer, through every controlled meal, every silent suffering, every loss endured in private. The tragedy was not that she became an icon, it was that she was never allowed to stop being one. Sandra Dee's story is not simply the tale of a star, it is the story of a child placed on a stage too early, never given the room to step away, and forced to live a life measured against someone else's expectations.